Um, Welcome, greetings to all of you. It is so exciting to see so many people here at Mohawk Trail Library. My name is Julia White. I'm a history teacher here, and I'm one of the several people who helped bring this exhibit to our school. We're super excited. The first thing I was told I need to tell everyone is restrooms, in case you might need them. There are restrooms in the front lobby, right by the doors where you came in. There's also a restroom around this hallway, but only the ladies' room is open, but I heard it is a unisex bathroom for tonight. So just letting you know. I guess my job is to kind of give people just a little bit of kind of history about how this happened. About a year ago, I was sitting in a local cultural council meeting with Tinky and several other kind and lovely people, and we heard about a grant from Mass Humanities that was going to bring the Smithsonian exhibit to 6 places in rural Massachusetts. And I almost fell off my chair saying, it has to be us, it has to come here. And so I convinced the council that I would get the help of my lovely history teachers, Bethany and Catherine in the back, and who jumped on board immediately and said, yes, of course, we want to talk about voices and votes. This is close to the hearts of history teachers. So we're so really, really proud that they chose us as a venue and have had a wonderful experience working with Mass Humanities and with the Smithsonian Museum on Main Street staff to bring this here. This will officially be our 4th kind of event. So we have had an opening event. We had a Hilltown draw around where we worked with the art garden, which was also fabulous. We, last Thursday, had the Center for New Americans do a program on immigration, on becoming an American, and we had a bunch of panelists talk about their experience. If you missed it, it is on YouTube on the mtrsd.org website for the Smithsonian. Hopefully, many of you got to walk through the exhibit already before now, but if you didn't, it is open during the week. We have lots of really fabulous local people who are willing to sit and be docents to allow the public to come into the library and see the exhibit. It's open on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Saturdays. Or Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursday nights, and Saturdays. Yes, Bethany has been coordinating this to par excellence. We have a few more events coming. Next Thursday night, it is a Food for Thought night. It is a combination of the history of food and democracy, which I think is fascinating, and a community conversation around how communities are morphing and changing and recreating themselves. So that will be next Thursday at 6. The following week, 5:30, sorry, thank you. The following week will be a trivia night with the League of Women Voters. So come on out and see if you can win some prizes in trivia night. Then we have a closing night where we're going to have a bunch of civics projects by our students on display and some work from elementary schools and capstone projects from our seniors. It's going to be, and a bunch of patriotic music and a lovely concert. So that will be fun. I think that covers everything I'm supposed to say, and I hope you enjoy tonight's programming. We are so, so happy to be partnered with the Charlemont Forum, and they can bring you this lovely program for tonight. So without further ado, Mr. Lessels.
I just want to first thank Julia and Tinky for bringing this all here, and the exhibit in the back, if you haven't walked through it, if you got here late, it's worth walking through at the end. It's really well done and reminds us all of sort of how important all this is. The Charlemont Forum, if you don't know of it, usually takes place at the Charlemont Federated Church. We're kind of branching out. We have done some occasionally at other places. It's our tagline is sort of inspiring lectures, respectful dialogue. And so we try to bring interesting speakers about a whole wide range of subjects, all the way from voting rights to, in the fall, we'll have a panel on food, and food in New England particularly. So we really try to hit a wide spectrum, and the unifying element is that we try to find really good, interesting speakers who know their subject intensely, so that they can really go into depth on it. And the other piece of it is that we have a pretty active back and forth between you and the speaker, and so there's lots of opportunity to ask questions, make comments, have discussion. We will also meet, or if people want to stay around afterwards, we'll have refreshments out on the way in, and more opportunity to discuss what's been presented. So along that line, I want to just put a plug in for our next 3 forums. We generally run between 2 and 4 events a year, depending sort of on the speakers we can find, and this has been a pretty fertile year, so that's great. So our next forum will be on June 26th at the Charlemont Federated Church, and it will be David Tatel, who has recently written a book called Blind. He was a DC Circuit Court judge for his entire career, and realized partway through that he was becoming blind. And it's about his learning how to manage that, and also about his experience as a DC Circuit Court judge, which, as you know, is the most powerful circuit court, the most powerful court below the Supreme Court. So I think that should be fascinating. That's June 26th. Then July 17th, we have Douglas Arian, who will present on light pollution and its harmful effects on humanity and nature, and how to mitigate them. And so that's another one that I think will be fascinating. And then on September 18th here, we'll have a panel presentation on local fresh food. It will be about what we're eating, who grows it, how it's supplied, and another one that should be really interesting. So tonight I want to welcome UMass Professor Jesse Rhodes, who's going to speak to us on voting rights. Professor Rhodes' research revolves around struggles over race, representation, and civil and voting rights, and their consequences for politics and policymaking in the U.S. He's written extensively on inequality and representation, voting rights politics, education politics, economic, racial, and political inequality, presidential rhetoric, and party politics. He received his PhD from the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia in the spring of 2008, and he's the co-director of the University of Massachusetts Amherst Poll, which combines cutting-edge online polling with academic and professional expertise in the science of politics. The results of the UMass poll have been featured on NBC, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, the Washington Post, among other minor media. So it's really a well thought of poll. So without further ado, thank you to Professor Rhodes.
Oh, and thank you so much. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce, for the really generous introduction. And I want to thank you and Marianne Adams and the Charlemont Forum for just this really wonderful opportunity to talk with all of you. Also to thank Julia and Tinky and the rest of the Mohawk Trail Regional School team for bringing in this fabulous exhibit. If you haven't checked it out yet, I hope you will. And then to all of you for joining what I hope will be a nice discussion today. So I am talking about the importance of the right to vote in contemporary American politics. And I think what I want to emphasize to you today is, in spite of all of the bad news, and don't get me wrong, there is a lot of it currently, there are reasons for guarded optimism if we as Americans seize our responsibilities as citizens and really make use of the rights that we have as citizens. And so I'm also want to suggest that there are lots of lessons that we can learn from American history, some of which is reflected in the exhibit tonight, to help inform our actions today. So, and I'm going to be using slides, so hopefully they will continue to operate. Or not. Oh, there we go. Okay. So obviously we just had a really remarkable presidential election, almost unprecedented in American politics, where on the Democratic side, the sitting president was essentially involuntarily cast aside due to concerns about his age and acuity, and replaced with his vice president for the remainder of the general election campaign. On the Republican side, a former president, a convicted felon, and someone who had proposed essentially an insurrection against the United States government, survived an assassination attempt and was ultimately elected to the presidency for a non-consecutive term, which has only happened once previously in our nation's history. And what I want to suggest is that this has had, of course, really important implications for our rights as American citizens. So early in his presidency, Trump signed an executive order that would have made really dramatic changes in the way that we do elections in this country. So the order proposed to prohibit the counting of mail ballots that were received after an election, which would really drastically affect which ballots were counted, given that many people cast ballots right around Election Day by mail, and so they're not received until after the election. More radically, he proposed that individuals who sought to use the federal registration process to register to vote would have to provide proof of citizenship, which has never been required before to register to vote through the federal form. And there are estimates that if that were allowed to continue, that it would effectively disenfranchise 21 million otherwise eligible voters. And then he also proposed to try to leverage federal election funds to force states to do the same, to require states to demand proof of citizenship in order to be eligible to vote and to cast a ballot. Now, much of this order has been enjoined by federal courts, and so it seems to be on hold, and it's unclear whether President Trump will continue to push this forward, but it suggests his interest in trying to shape the electorate and shape who has access to the ballot. And of course, this reflects his broader stated concern, without evidence, importantly, that millions of ineligible people are casting ballots in elections, and that those illegal voters allegedly benefit the Democratic Party at the Republicans' expense. Now, meanwhile, there have been a lot of election policy making at the state level. And over the last 2 decades, states have engaged in an almost unprecedented degree of attention to election policy making. Some states have been making it easier to vote by enacting reforms such as same-day registration or automatic voter registration or no-excuse absentee voting. Other states have been making it harder to vote, for example, by enacting voter identification laws or prohibiting no-excuse absentee voting. States have played around with redistricting, some engaging in very substantial partisan gerrymandering in their redistricting processes. And states have also played around a lot with election administration, sometimes to make, for example, voting wait times easier and shorter. In other cases, actually enacting reforms that produce fewer polling locations and make it so it takes longer to vote. And so what you see in this figure is an estimate of whether states' electoral democracies have gotten better or worse. And the way that this is measured is scholars have put together 53 measures of the quality of democracy, everything from whether you have same-day registration or automatic voter registration or can register online, to voting wait times and the share of individuals who are disenfranchised due to a felony conviction and so forth. And using those 53 measures, they created an estimate of how high quality your democracy is. Is it good or is it a little weaker? And what this figure shows is change across all 50 states between 2000 and 2023. And what you see is an interesting story. So just over half of the states have improved during this period. So that's the good news. The bad news is that just under half of the states have gotten worse, and some of them have gotten a lot worse, right? And so those are the states that have the bars that go below 0. And so what this is showing is a real polarization among our states in the quality of their democracies and how easy it is to vote, how fair representation is, and how well states administer elections to make them fair and transparent and accountable to citizens. And so this is a really troubling development. There's been understandably a lot of focus on, in recent times, in President Trump's actions, but actually a lot of the really worrisome developments in terms of the quality of our democracy has occurred at the state level. And this is because states have primary responsibility to administer elections in this country. And one thing that is really interesting is that Americans are sensing that democracy, especially in recent years and months, is getting worse. So what you see here is a series of polls, and this is a really interesting poll because they track all Americans, also divided by Democrats and Republicans. Those are the red and blue lines. The purple line is all Americans. And then they also ask experts, so this is like political scientists and historians and sociologists, about how do they think American democracy is doing, right? And so 100s would be that democracy is perfect. 0 would be that democracy is a disaster, that we live in a dictatorship. And what we've seen is that, especially since President Trump was reelected, there's been a real significant fall off in many Americans' perceptions of the quality of democracy. And surprisingly, that's also true among Republicans, which is really interesting. They got very excited when Trump was elected, but since then they've kind of sobered a little bit. And so these developments that I've been talking about are reflected both among experts and public opinion, that people perceive that democracy is facing some challenges today. So what's going on? And what I want to do in a lot of this talk is put things in some historical perspective. And a really important theme in American history that resonates to this day is that voting has always been heavily contested in American political life, that it has always been a center point of conflict over who has power and who has membership. And as I'll be suggesting, not infrequently that conflict has involved violence as well as political contestation. And today, as in previous eras in American history, this contestation reflects underlying developments in American politics that make our politics seem more fraught and more zero-sum. So when we have rising economic inequality and increasing racial and ethnic diversity and rising partisan polarization, it creates a context when many Americans feel uncertain, angry, upset, and this creates opportunities for elected officials to exploit these anxieties for short-term political gain. And this has been a recurrent feature in our politics, and we see it today, I think most often reflected in claims that there are ineligible people committing election fraud and distorting our elections. And it's really important that those claims don't have hard evidence to back them up. It's always possible to find in an election that 1 or 2 people cast a ballot who shouldn't have casted a ballot, or they cast it in the wrong precinct. But systemic, large-scale fraud just doesn't seem to be present in our politics. And these things lead to voting to become a real center point of political struggle. Now, there's a lot of understandable anxiety and concern, even fear, about the state of our democracy today. And what I want to suggest is, while those concerns are very much warranted, it's also very valuable and important to remember that Americans have faced down serious and even existential threats to democracy before. And what I want to suggest is that we can learn lessons from that history and apply it today. It's also really important to remind ourselves that even in these very difficult and challenging times, if we look at public opinion polls, Americans are not shifting whole scale to authoritarianism. They want democracy. They believe in democracy. They believe in the separation of powers. They believe in checks and balances. And this should give us some guarded hope about the prospects for democratic renewal. It's also really important, and we had some great conversation at dinner about this, that the institutions are not coming to save us, but as citizens, we collectively can work to renew our democracy. That at the end of the day, democracy starts and stops with all of us. And a really important lesson is to really make full use of the rights that we enjoy as American citizens so as not to lose them. And of course, at the end of the day, exercising your rights doesn't guarantee with certainty that you will keep them, but failing to do so virtually guarantees that you will not continue to enjoy those rights. So I want to end with this kind of encouragement for civic and political renewal. So obviously, I think the insurrection of January 6th is fresh in our mind, right? That this is a very searing episode in recent American history when a large number of Americans, encouraged by the then President of the United States, Trump, assaulted the U.S. Capitol in order to try to stop the certification of Joe Biden as president. And this was a shocking moment in our history. It was a moment that really seemed to suggest kind of a low point in our politics, where the ordinary give and take of democracy was being replaced or supplanted by a resort to violence. And understandably, this moment was searing and was disturbing and should be to those of us who care about democratic practice. It's also really important to remember that in the broad scope of American history, violence in the context of elections is not that unusual. So if we go back in time, to the 1830s and 1840s, we find an era that actually is not unlike our own, an era with high economic inequality, with fairly regular economic recessions, with a very high level of immigration. At the time, it was immigration primarily from predominantly Catholic countries, a lot of Irish immigration, German Catholic immigration. And at that time, the nation, not unlike today, was swept with a wave of xenophobia. And this xenophobia not infrequently manifested in the rise of harshly anti-immigrant parties. So this was a period in which the Know Nothing Party emerged, which was essentially concerned with cutting off immigration and protecting so-called Americanism. Any of those who have seen Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, this is very much in that vein. And this not infrequently resulted in violence. And so the image that you see here depicted is an image of the Philadelphia Bible riots of May through July of 1844. And so in this case, Philadelphia citizens, overwhelmingly Protestant, were very worried about the influx of Catholic immigrants, fearful that the Catholics would overturn what was then common practice of teaching the King James version of the Bible in public schools, and they rioted. And the local militia were called out to put down these anti-Catholic riots. The rioters were destroying millions of dollars in contemporary dollar property. The militia, over the course of several days, killed estimates of over 24 rioters. And so we see here an episode early in our history that in many ways echoes our own, in which violence related to public policymaking and elections was prominent. We can also think of the Civil War as the original January 6th. So the Civil War was instigated when Southern states refused to recognize the legitimacy of the 1860 election, in which Abraham Lincoln became president. They seceded and initiated a conflict which lasted more than 4 years and cost 750,000 American lives by many estimates. After the Civil War, the North tried to reconstruct southern states and engaged in a military occupation for a period of time and sought to remake southern states in ways in which African Americans enjoyed equal rights. And for a time, actually, for roughly 12 years, they did. And many African Americans were elected to local, state, and federal office, enjoyed equal rights. But unfortunately, the federal government lacked the will and capacity to suppress very determined resistance from white supremacists who wanted to redeem the South and reinstitute white rule in those states. And so between the late 1870s and 1900, the southern states effectively expelled Northern control, established Jim Crow constitutions, and in the context, by many estimates, murdered at least 150 African American people in each year between 1875 and 1900. In many cases, individuals were trying to assert their political rights. The women's suffrage movement, often viewed as a kind of jewel in American history, which it was, but it was one that at the time was extraordinarily controversial, and a moment where many Americans, male and female, felt threatened by the changes in gender role and gender power that the women's suffrage movement foretold. And many women's suffrage movement activists who engaged in civil disobedience were imprisoned. Some of those who were imprisoned would go on hunger strike. And in some cases, those hunger strikers were force-fed. And so what you see in this image is an image of Alice Paul, who was a leading women's suffragist at the time. During one imprisonment stay where she went on a lengthy hunger strike, she was force-fed at least 55 times over the course of several weeks. And then finally, and this is, I suspect, probably the most well-known story, the modern civil rights movement's efforts to have the United States live up to the expectations of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution met with widespread massive resistance to reenfranchisement and the recognition of equal rights. And of course, this is a very famous image from Selma on Bloody Sunday, when efforts to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery to recognize the rights of African Americans to vote were savagely put down. In the foreground, we see John Lewis being beaten by a Selma police officer and state police. And so my point here is that we've seen many episodes in American history where it seemed like fundamental rights, fundamental voting rights, which appear to be available to all of us in the United States Constitution and its amendments, have not been recognized in practice. And in fact, Americans have sought to suppress, including forcibly suppress, their fellow citizens in their efforts to recognize and enjoy those rights. And yet, Americans have persisted. And in each of those episodes, I think it's really critical to emphasize, we did see progress, and we did see Americans face down these threats and ultimately, if not fully reaffirm, at least advance the promise of rights for themselves and for their fellow citizens. And so how did they do this? Are there things that we can learn? Are there lessons of history that we can take with us to help inspire us today? And I think that there are some lessons that are very useful. So one lesson that I think is central to each of these pro-democracy movements is that they were broad-based. They enjoyed representation and membership across social class, across race and ethnicity, across gender, across region. And these diverse movements had power in part because of the geographic basis of representation in our democracy, in part because the broad base meant that it was much harder to represent these movements as just representing a certain section or a certain faction and so forth. Second, these movements engaged in mass collective action in person. That these were movements where people got off the couch, engaged in activity together, and not just symbolic activity. And something I want to emphasize, and we'll talk about, is these activities were very strategic, and they were intended to accomplish specific goals. And if and when they were able to focus collective action in a strategic way, it tended to have a very powerful effect. And this is really important, that movements need to focus on pressuring people. That although movements are about achieving high ideals, it's impossible in democratic politics to keep your hands clean. That politics, including democratic politics, is about power. And social movements engaged in activities in order to achieve political goals, to win power. And there's nothing wrong with that, so long as you follow the processes of our politics, recognize the importance of democratic practices, and respect your opposition. And then finally, it's really important that although these movements sought power, they sought power in order to advance the nation's highest ideals, right? So in order, for example, for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act to be enacted into law, Democrats had to win a filibuster-proof majority. But winning a filibuster-proof majority, which is an electoral goal, served the end of advancing fundamental rights. And so these things are really fused in an important way. So let me just talk a little bit about each of these, using the civil rights movement as an example. So the modern civil rights movement was distinctive insofar that while certainly African Americans were the most important and prominent actors and bore the brunt of violence and suppression at the hands of state and local governments, their success was attributable in part because they drew in a variety of allies, perhaps most importantly from the labor movement. That the AFL-CIO became a staunch ally of the civil rights movement, and at the time, organized labor was a very potent national force. It was also very important that the civil rights movement, in part because it was led by clergy and religious leaders, that they were able to bring in liberal Protestants, liberal Catholics, liberal Jews into their ranks. And this was both substantively and symbolically important because it signaled to audiences that this was not just about African American rights, although it was, but this was about reaffirming fundamental democratic principles. These movements engaged in massive collective action, right? And so perhaps the signature feature of the civil rights movements was huge demonstrations and massive marches where thousands of people took to the streets and effectively dominated a city or an area for the day. Perhaps most famously in the picture on the right, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963. And this is important for a couple of reasons. First, because it signals to people sitting on the fence, to moderates, that this movement has legitimacy. There are lots of people involved. It's not just a special interest. It's not just a couple of wackos. There are large amounts of people involved, and they could be people just like you. Secondly, these large mass activities in person were very powerful experiences for the people involved, that it sent the signal that these people were members of a community, that they shared things in common, that they had a common purpose, and participation in events like these was, for many of the participants, very inspiring and reaffirming and encouraged further activism down the road. As I mentioned before, politics is about power. But it's about power, in this case, for the advancement of fundamental rights. And so the activists in the civil rights movement were at their best very strategic. So they just didn't, have a march or a movement for fun. they were trying to accomplish specific objectives, and they used political techniques in a strategic way to do this. So the image on the left is from the very famous Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. And what's critical here is the boycott was meant to advance justice and to overturn a serious injustice, which was segregation on municipal transit facilities. But it was advanced via hard-headed economic logic. And that logic was to deny the Montgomery Transit Authority revenue by boycotting and finding alternative ways to get to school or get to work or get to social events. You were using your pocketbook to coerce powerful authority to bend to your will, but to your will in a way that advanced our highest ideals. And so the reason why the Montgomery bus boycott worked was not because the movement activists had a moral cause, although they did. It was because they collectively levered their economic resources to bring the Montgomery Transit Authority to its knees. And this is a really important lesson, I think. We see a similar lesson in the image on the right, which is from sit-ins to try to desegregate the Greensboro, North Carolina Woolworth. And so these are individuals with the civil rights movement. They're seated. As you can see, they're enduring a lot of abuse. People are pouring stuff on their heads. They're yelling and screaming at them. And this is not just gratuitous suffering. It is very tactical insofar that when they're occupying those seats, how much money is that Greensboro or Woolworth making? Not much. And are they getting good press by these scenes being presented? No. And so again, the idea is to lever economic resources and political resources as a mode of coercion, but coercion that's legitimate because it's intended to redress something that is unjust and to advance the cause of justice. The modern civil rights movement was very savvy in terms of trying to attract media attention. And there was a lot of thinking involved about how to engage the media, how to create media spectacles. And this thinking was very strategic because it was believed that the movement could engineer spectacles that really dramatize the injustice that African Americans faced under Jim Crow. And so when we think about some of the most famous images of the civil rights movement, which in many cases involved enduring suffering at the hands of authorities, again, the idea was not simply to experience suffering, but rather to, through voluntarily giving oneself up to violence at the hands of the state, to dramatize just how unjust the circumstances were. And that by creating these iconic images and images that would shock the conscience of viewers, particularly in the North, it would create political pressure to transform a fundamentally unjust situation. And then finally, this is always very closely yoked to calling the nation to its highest ideals, right? That all aspects of the civil rights movement were focused on highlighting the gap between what the Constitution and the Reconstruction Amendments promised and the reality that was faced on the ground. And that each episode was intended to highlight that gap, and that by highlighting that distinction, call Americans to reaffirm those basic rights and extend them the full promise of the Constitution and the Reconstruction Amendments to all Americans. So what I want to do now is pivot and talk a little bit about our current crisis and how those lessons might be applicable under our current circumstances. So obviously we live in extraordinary times, and there are really important structural reasons for the period of polarization and threats to democracy that we face. So the first is just the really tremendous concentration of wealth among the wealthiest Americans. So on the left, you see a graph that looks at the share of the nation's income that's owned by the wealthiest top 1% and top 1/10 of 1%. And what we can see that we've basically risen above where we were at the most extreme level of concentration of income since the 1920s. Really reversing trends that had occurred from the 1940s into the 1970s. And it's really important to understand that wealth is even more concentrated than income. In fact, shockingly, in terms of wealth, the top 1% owns roughly 35% of all the nation's wealth. And the bottom 90% has to make do with about roughly 27% of the nation's total wealth. And so this extreme period of economic inequality creates circumstances where a lot of people feel like they're missing out, that they've been left behind, that their children's lives will not be as good as theirs were. And that creates a reservoir of anxiety and frustration, which can be vulnerable to manipulation. Second, a really important development is a very dramatic change in our nation's demographics. So what you see here is a graph that charts the share of Americans by different racial and ethnic groups. And the really important story is at the bottom in dark green, which is the share of Americans who identify as white. Just 4 decades ago, in 1980, roughly 80% of Americans identified as white. Today, we are closer to 58%. So really drastic change. And a lot of that is attributable to real changes in our legal immigration system. So the really significant loosening of legal immigration from the 1965 onward. And then, of course, also a pretty significant influx of unauthorized immigration, particularly since 1990. And what this does is, especially but not limited to many white Americans, concern about cultural change, concern about competition for jobs, fear about the status of whites as their ability to retain their kind of traditional dominance in American society. And then capping things off, yeah, yeah. Sure. So we've got white at the bottom, then black or African American, Hispanic, and the light blue is Asian, and then it has all other. And again, you know, any way we try to categorize these, there's always going to be folks who don't fit in perfectly into any of these categories. We just have to do the best that we can, given the need to try to aggregate and generalize. But it's a great question. So I know I don't want to go on too long because I want to have time for questions, but I really want to highlight the importance of partisan polarization. And so what you see here is a figure that looks at the share of Republicans who have a very unfavorable view of Democrats and the share of Democrats who have a very unfavorable view of Republicans. And this tracks this over time, over about 30 years from 1994 to the present, roughly. And what we see is a huge increase in negative emotions or negative views towards people who belong to the other party. And this is true both among Democrats and Republicans. And so political scientists call this affective polarization, which is just a fancy way of saying negative emotions towards people who belong to the other party. And this is a really serious problem because if you're already predisposed to dislike people from the other side, you're likely to believe all kinds of bad things about them, whether they're true or not. And again, this creates opportunities for politicians to take advantage of those anxieties. And so one way that politicians take advantage of those anxieties is about making claims that elections are skewed by people who shouldn't be voting. And so over the last few decades, it's become a very prominent set of claims reported by national political elites, as well as many in the media, that our elections are being distorted by so-called ineligible voters or illegal voters. often these claims are implicitly or explicitly racialized, making the claim that undocumented immigrants or non-citizens are voting in elections fraudulently. And it's also really important that there's, again, not evidence that this has occurred, but because of these underlying economic and xenophobic anxieties, these kinds of claims have a resonance that they might not in more economically and politically stable times. Okay, so I'm going to just skip over and in the interest of time, kind of focus on, given all this bad news, why should we still have some optimism? Well, I've talked a little bit about American history and the lessons that we can learn from history. Now I want to bring some more contemporary social science into the conversation. So first of all, it's really important to keep in mind that in spite of all this bad news, Americans are still committed to democracy. And how do I know this? Well, there's recent polling that suggests that this is true. So this is a recent poll from PRRI, and it asks two questions. So one question is, do you think that we should postpone the 2026 elections until we get the crisis under control? And the good news is that hardly anybody wants to postpone the elections, and that includes Republicans. The overwhelming majority of people want those elections to take place when they're supposed to take place, and that's true even among a supermajority of Republicans. So that's pretty good news. It's also good news that hardly anybody wants a president to serve a third term. They don't want to amend the Constitution. They don't want people talking about serving a third term in office. And this is true even among Republicans who right now might have the strongest incentives to say, yeah, let's let this guy serve a third term. Okay, so in spite of all this bad news, Americans still respect some of the basic norms of democracy. They also don't think that the president should be ignoring Congress or the courts. So this same survey asked, should the president be able to do whatever he wants, essentially, and ignore the other co-equal branches of government? And very few Americans endorse this. And also 3/4 of Republicans reject this idea. So again, even among those who might have the strongest short-term incentives to think that, yeah, let's let this guy go ahead, they reject this overwhelmingly. Additionally, this is from the same survey on the left, over half of Americans think that the current president is behaving like a dictator. And this is just 100 days into his term. And so this is pretty striking, where you actually have a real numerical majority of Americans with this perception. It's also really important that President Trump is historically unpopular. And as our own surveying with the UMass poll suggests, it's not just because Democrats don't like him or because he's been president before and has a long history, although that's true. It's that people don't like the way he's going about doing things, independent of whether they support his policies. They don't like it when he seems to break with the processes and the norms of our democracy. So the last thing I want to emphasize is that there's good reason to think that nonviolence and exercising the rights of citizenship in a country like the United States makes a big difference. So some of you might be familiar with Erica Chenoweth's research. She's a scholar at Harvard University, and she and her colleagues studied hundreds of campaigns that sought to change policies, or even in the case of authoritarian countries, force transitions from authoritarianism to democracy. And she compared nonviolent campaigns that use strategies like voice and protest and boycotts and rallies and so forth against campaigns that were violent, that actually involved guerrilla warfare against the state. And what they found was surprising. They looked at the share of campaigns that succeeded or failed by the type of campaign. Was it nonviolent or was it violent? And what they found was that the nonviolent campaigns succeeded in all of their goals more than half the time. Compare that with the violent campaigns that only had a success rate of 25%. The nonviolent campaign, or the violent campaigns, failed more than half the time, whereas the nonviolent campaigns failed at a much lower rate. And so the takeaway here was that nonviolence works. Exercising democratic rights works in terms of achieving goals and importantly also maintaining democracy. So they also looked at, well, what happened in these countries 5 years after the campaign? And what they found was that succeed or fail, the nonviolent campaigns were much more likely to have democracies after the fact, which is very, very important. Now, why is this? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is that nonviolent campaigns are accessible to almost anybody, right? If you're going to participate in a guerrilla band, you've got to have certain skills and a certain kind of moral looseness, to say the least, in order to be successful. Typically, you have to be fairly physically fit, whereas nonviolent activities are accessible to almost anybody. They provide a variety of options for participation, everything from writing songs to participating in a rally to participating in a boycott, whereas a violent campaign, your options are somewhat limited. Unlike violent campaigns, nonviolent campaigns reaffirm democratic ideals. They disagree with the opposition, but they acknowledge and respect the legitimacy of the opposition. They also reassure moderates, right? So if you're on the fence about which side to go with, you're going to be more likely to be willing to work with or support or form a coalition with someone who's not trying to kill you or people like you. And then finally, nonviolent campaigns are more likely to engender sympathy from other countries, right? So we can think very recently about the divest and sanctions movement against the apartheid South Africa, right? That the apartheid movement, as it moved into the 80s and 90s, was able to engender a lot of sympathy, and the boycotts and sanctions against the apartheid regime played an important role in bringing down that regime and South Africa's transition to democracy. So just to kind of finalize, this was some of you may have seen this. This is an op-ed in today's New York Times by 3 very prominent political scientists. And the emphasis here is that no one ever confronted autocracy and maintained democracy by standing on the sidelines. And so what I want to emphasize to you is that American history and social science strongly support the idea that exercising our rights as American citizens works. And that what I want to encourage you, although I suspect this is already a very politically active audience, is to fully embrace the rights that we enjoy as Americans, to vote and join organizations and support organizations that defend democracy, participate in nonviolent activism, including boycotts and sit-ins against organizations or businesses that don't. And at the end of the day, it's our responsibility as democratic citizens to maintain democracy. There's no one coming to save us except for ourselves. So thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Jesse. We're going to put the mic here, and if people have questions or comments, ideally come here. If you, for some reason, can't come here, we can extend this a little bit, or you can speak from your seat. Just speak very loudly, please. Yeah.
I'll be the first to go.
You need to get the microphone.
I can't get up.
You said bring it to you.
Yeah, I think I can.
That's why you said that.
It'll go that far.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah.
No, my question is, in the times that we're living in, what kind of an economic boycott would draw attention to policymakers from either side that might move them to change their actions politically, particularly in Congress?
Yeah, so great question. So I think moving policymakers takes a lot of thought. I do think in the short run it can be possible to at least put some pressure on businesses and industries. So we've seen some of this, right? So the Target boycotts over the end of DEI policies seems to be hurting Target's bottom line. And Costco seems to be a primary beneficiary. Whether that's going to lead to change, I can't say yet. But more to your point, those of you, I don't know if any of you have Tesla stock, but Tesla has taken a beating. And it appears to be in significant part due to a negative reaction to Elon Musk's role in Trump's government. And it seems like it may hasten his departure from the White House. And it also seems to have encouraged Trump to take steps to rein Musk in, which I think is a pretty significant development. At the start of Trump's presidency, Musk was essentially operating without constraints. And it appears, based on reporting, that he is now under more control, or the parameters to what he's allowed to do. Now, again, I'm not going to substantively endorse Trump's view of what the federal government should be doing, but that's a very important change. Whether I like it or not, he was elected president of the United States. Under our system of government, he has a lot of authority. Elon Musk doesn't. And so the use of economic leverage to shift Musk's incentives and possibly hasten his departure from government, I think suggests the possible influence of boycotts. Now, how could there be leverage on other members of Congress? People would have to think really creatively about what that might look like, what industries to target, and what might be some of the consequences. But I do think that there are contemporary examples that suggest the possible power of boycotts.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, come on up.
Hi.
Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
The question about media. So back with the civil rights movement, you had 3 networks. Granted, I think we had a lot of radio stations, a lot of newspapers, more newspapers than we do now. But I would imagine probably most people got their news about the movement through those networks. Mm-hmm. So how has our very stratified, siloed, fragmented media environment changed the role that media could play? Yeah,
so great question. I think I have a 2-part answer. So I think you're absolutely right that it is harder in some ways to break through now than it was when there was fewer options and more people were watching the 3 major networks. That said, people who study the media and look at coverage, there's a whole lot of sameness across media, and a lot of that. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that there aren't that many entities that have the resources to do original reporting. And so a lot of what passes for media, unfortunately, these days, there's not enough money in media to pay journalists to do good work. And so they echo each other. And that to a large degree is independent of ideology. And so I do think in spite of the fragmentation, there are aspects of our environment that enable this. The second is a lot of media is very highly concentrated now. There's a high concentration of ownership. And in order to save money, again, they don't diversify programming. They keep programming fairly uniform and consistent. So although we do have an apparent fragmentation of our media, it actually, in some ways, is more concentrated than it was in the past. So I take the point, and I think that you're right, that it probably is harder to break in now than it was before. I don't think that it's true that people on the left and the right are getting totally different news stories. Most of the coverage is very, very similar. If you go to the opinion shows, that's different. But if you're watching the quote-unquote hard news segments, you're getting a lot of the same content.
We'll give it to the woman from the back row.
Hi, thank you for your discussion and talk tonight. Do you think that if Article 1 of the Constitution had not given states, the power for their own election laws, that we would be in a different place historically than we are now?
Yes, that's a great question. Now, whether that would be a better place or a worse place, I think is really complicated, and I think you could make the argument for some of both. So, historically and contemporaneously, one of the criticisms of the allocation of primary responsibility for the regulation of elections to the states is that, wow, it just allows for too much diversity, right? And it's not fair that in some states you only have to wait a couple minutes on average to vote, but in other states it could, take you 30 minutes or an hour to cast a ballot. That just, there's something seems wrong. Or it seems wrong that in the state where I was born and raised, Indiana, you have to show a photo ID in order to vote. But in Massachusetts, all I have to do is go in and tell the person my name and where I live. That something seems off about that. And I'm fairly sympathetic to that concern. And I'm also fairly sympathetic in normal times to a lot of consistency across space, because it is consistent with our understanding of fairness in terms of the experience of election. That said, when we have a president who has very particular views about elections and who should be voting in elections, I'm very grateful that I live in a state like Massachusetts that is going to defend what I think is a pretty, not without flaws, but pretty equitable and open system of voting. And so there are some virtues to federalism in our election system, because it creates the opportunities to preserve a wide access and broad access to the ballot when the federal government is taking a different position. So I don't think there's any simple answer to whether centralized elections or decentralized elections are better. A lot depends on the context, and also a lot depends on where you live. I mean, I think that it's quite possible elections might be freer and fairer in Massachusetts than they would be under many nationalized systems, because Massachusetts does a pretty good job on the whole. Now, if I were living in Mississippi or Texas, I might long for the federal government to kind of take over if I thought that it would raise the ceiling. But I would, because the states are so different, a lot depends on where you live, that we might actually, in this state, be worse off if the federal government were regulating elections more stringently than it does now. So there's no simple answer. Federalism is a really complex feature of American democracy that can both enhance our rights in some ways and also constrain them.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm just wondering if you're familiar with Greg Palast's analysis of this last election in light of the voter suppression that he's been trying to measure for decades, and that Kamala Harris would have won if the voter suppression hadn't been happening. And what do you think of that? Is it accurate information?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so great question. I wouldn't want to speak specifically on Palast. I'm not familiar with the details of the methodology. I will say that there's very well documented and established research that suggests, for example, that felony disenfranchisement laws have had implications in presidential elections, and probably, for example, helped push George W. Bush over the line. Now, the 2000 election was complicated for a lot of reasons, but there's pretty good empirical information that felony disenfranchisement laws, for example, appear to have shifted some presidential elections and some Senate elections. There are also some arguments which are a little bit more contested that at the margins, voter identification laws might be disproportionately affecting African American and Latinx voters. And because those voters disproportionately vote for Democrats, that could hurt Democrats in some elections. Look, our elections are really tight right now. Donald Trump won the presidential election by 0.5 percentage point. And that's almost random variation. So we do have to be really attuned in close elections to access to the ballot. And this is unfortunately a big reason why there's so much contestation over who can vote right now. That the parties believe, it's more controversial whether this is true, but they believe that manipulating who can vote at the margins has an impact, and that unfortunately incentivizes them to try to do this. And so one of the really sad features of contemporary elections is that the parties have gotten themselves into a headspace, particularly, unfortunately, the Republican Party, where instead of trying to persuade voters, there's been some focus on trying to discourage them from participating. And that may change, especially after the last few election cycles, where, believe it or not, Donald Trump's performance with voters of color has been improving a lot, actually. And so that although it is shaking up our electoral coalitions, could be good for democracy. That if Republicans believe that significant fractions of communities of color will vote for their candidates, that might discourage them from trying to suppress voter turnout. And so there's actually, in an interesting way, an argument for hoping that the party coalitions will change some, and that voters will diversify as groups who they vote for, because that would discourage racialized voter suppression.
Other questions?
So Julia asked me to say thank you on behalf of the
Oh.
school. This was so
thank you.
informative and really, really rich in detail, which was great. I think I know everything, and I didn't know some of the things you've said. A few observations. One is I learned from my recent poll work in my town that if every polling location had a bake sale, voter turnout would really increase. Also, I think that we as people in rural America are uniquely positioned, generally and specifically, to have more outreach between groups, because in the city you can only talk to people who agree with you politically. That's just the way things get arranged. Around here, if you didn't talk to people who didn't agree with you politically, you wouldn't have too many people to talk to. And specifically, this building, I know when I was coming inside, I was talking to some people who said they hadn't been in the building in years, or they'd never been in the building. I just want to say that one thing I've learned working with the wonderful teachers and staff members here is what an amazing job they are doing teaching civics to their students. We're going to have some terrific voters as soon as those kids turn 18. So thank you guys, and thank you, Jesse. And thank you, Forum.
Protests. There's been a lot of protests, a lot of people standing up and exercising our voice. So what do you think it would take to get those folks to speak up about the structure of our government, even if they may agree with what he's doing, to stand up against the way he's doing it?
So great question. The cynical part of me suggests that what folks need is a good loss in an election, and that it is really important that elected officials they will do what they're doing, and they'll do what they want to do until they start to experience costs for doing those things. And so elections are really, really important for holding people accountable for their behavior. Now, absolutely today that can be quite challenging in many states because of gerrymandering and districting. And so many members of Congress have relatively safe general election races. They primarily face competition in their primaries. But Republicans only have the House by 2 seats, I think, right now. And at present, they are on trajectory for a real drubbing in 2026, assuming we do have free and fair elections, knock on wood. And so I think the first step would be to suffer losses. That is how in a well-functioning democracy we get good behavior, is to punish people electorally by voting them out of office. And again, assuming that we do have free and fair elections, at this point Republicans are on trajectory to get beat up in 2026 as a party. And that would be good for democracy. And I want to emphasize that that's a general statement. So, if we had circumstances where Democrats are going way off of what it seems that the public wants, they deserve to lose big too, right? And that's kind of a general principle. But I think that's what's needed. They need to believe that unless they show independence from a president who to the degree that the president is infringing on basic rights or not respecting the processes laid out in our Constitution, that they will get hurt and they will lose the ability to do things that they want to do, which is make Republican policy. I think that's really, really important. The other thing that I think needs to happen is that people need to work on the individuals and the organizations that support Republicans in Congress. So who donates to those people, that's a public record. And shaming and organizing against donors, or against organizations that bundle donations, that make those members' careers possible, that's a secondary way of trying to impose pressure to make it costly socially, and in terms of exposure publicly, to support politicians who seem to not be adhering to democratic principles. So I think that's another avenue, but the primary one is to vote people out. That you want to have big turnout in districts. It needs to be about, in part, bake sales are good. We were talking earlier about bringing alcohol back into elections like we did in the 19th century, which was among the eligible electorate, much higher turnout than in our current politics. So there was something there. But elections and holding those people accountable is really the key.
Thank you so much for your talk, and all the questions have been so interesting.
Yeah.
The photos that you showed from the civil rights movement that you talked about shocking our conscience as a nation, I am curious what you think it would take to shock our conscience as a nation now. We've seen so much extreme violence that we seem to, I don't know, some people even enjoy. Like it really, the landscape has changed so much. So I'm wondering, you talked about kind of targeting protests to kind of create the reactions that, or the situations that will get reactions. So I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah. So great question. And I think there's a couple ways of answering that question. I think the first one is first of all, it's really important to remember that in the 1960s, when we saw these horrible pictures, there were a whole lot of people who thought that was great, who, wanted to see civil rights protesters get beaten up and thrown in prison, and, cheered for Bull Connor and, other authoritarian actors, George Wallace, for example. And so there is always going to be a segment of the population that does have kind of more authoritarian orientations that is going to be very hard to persuade. I also want to emphasize that while it is true that perhaps we haven't seen the whole-scale systemic changes that we want, I do think that it would be wrong to conclude that in important instances that there's been no change. So, for example, if we were to take the Black Lives Matter movement, is it true that there is no longer police violence against unarmed African American people? Of course not. People still are shot and killed by police. However, there's really good empirical evidence that there's been a dramatic nationwide change in attention to this issue, in recognition that it is a problem. In cities across the country, there have been efforts to change policing, to not abolish the police, but change policing and demand reforms of policing. There is litigation in many areas, and some of which has been successful. Police officers have been convicted of killing unarmed black people, which is extraordinarily rare in American history. And so while by no means have we, solved the problem, I think it'd also be wrong to argue that there has not been important progress made. And of course, that progress is unfinished, and the work continues and probably will continue for a very long time. I do think that suggests reason for hope. One last thing is that we do need to keep timescales in mind, right? So we often think about the civil rights movement in terms of the flashpoints that we really, really remember: the March on Washington, enactment of the Civil Rights Act, and Selma, and the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act in 1968, and so forth. But it's really critical to remember that most scholars date the civil rights movement decades back to the end of World War II, if not before. And so if we think of things that way, using, the Black Lives Matter movement as an example, we're still relatively early in that struggle. And so what we might want to do is think about what it would look like to revisit the really important question you answered 20 years from now. And if the answer is that we're still where we are now, that would be disturbing, but I want to, reserve hope that we will have made further progress.
All right, we're going to have one more question, and then I would encourage everybody to hang around by the refreshments and have some informal discussion. And see the exhibit. The exhibit is excellent. I would, if you haven't been through there, please do.
Yeah, my question has to do with, again, you're looking at a longer time scale, but if my concern is that the current Congress will, undo a lot of the institutions and break a lot of the things that a lot of Americans rely on, and will cause a lot of suffering and great harm to large, swaths of the nation. Again, maybe you answered it in the question before the last one, but in terms of, local, my local elected leaders at the Senate, that go to DC from here, are already sort of, advocating what I would want them to, but so. What other influence do we have? And, how can we prevent this great harm, that, the breaking of a lot of the institutions and the defunding of a lot of important things? So, what can we do to prevent that from happening next week or next month or so, I guess.
Yeah. So it's such an important question. And, I don't want to minimize the risks that we face in the short run, and I think that you're right that it absolutely is the case that it is possible that in the short to medium run that some of these institutions could get broken, and we should not sugarcoat the circumstances that we're in, it is possible that those actions could produce significant suffering, right? And there's real reason for concern, and that reason is absolutely valid. I think that there's two really important things to keep in mind. One, if that is our lot, then we don't have any choice but to face it. And I think there's two possible ways to face it. One is by kind of lapsing into despair or nihilism, and the other one is to have the resolve to fight, right, and to try to do what we can. And so I think that's a very important choice that we all have to make as citizens, and I'd hope that we make the choice to try to exercise the rights that we have to do what we can, even in the face potentially of crisis. The second thing is to try to think about creatively what we can do within the state, within the region, to try to head off those possibilities, and then if they start to arise, to try to cope with them. So, for example, some of you may be familiar with that universities in the region are trying to band together to engage in mutual defense in the event that the Trump administration comes after them, as it seems to be doing with regard to some of the Ivies right now. And again, the resources of all these institutions are limited. I don't think that there's any dewy-eyedness about what is possible. Nonetheless, I think we have a responsibility to make the effort. And certainly we're going to be much stronger together working as a community and in coalition than we would be individually. The last thing I would say is an important lesson, I think, from the current administration is that entities or organizations that resist and don't comply in advance have done much better than the entities that have preemptively complied. So if we think about, for example, Columbia University, which was targeted by the Trump administration, appeared to try to be addressing the Trump administration's concerns, and it made no difference, right? That they still lost additional funding. Whereas institutions that have resisted, sure, there are efforts to try to punch them further, but they seem to be doing a little bit better. And there's a good reason for this, that when you resist, you raise the costs. And the other side has to make cost risk benefit analysis of whether it's worth continuing to tangle with you. We can kind of make an analogy to the schoolyard bully situation, where you could either be the kid who gives up your lunch money or the kid who is going to take a swing. Which maybe I shouldn't be saying this in a school, but. I think the analogy is apt that it pays to be the kid who it's going to be hard to take the lunch money from, and I think that's an important lesson, that you want to make sure that if you believe that important fundamental rights are at stake, that you as a citizen make it costly to those who would want to do it. And when I say costly, I'm within the law, right? I'm not advocating lawlessness here, but I think that fully exercising our rights as citizens and certainly banding together and forming coalitions and communities can be very powerful tools to mitigate some of those harms.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And I just want to put another plug in. If you enjoyed tonight, and I have to say that tonight's been one of the more fascinating presentations I've heard, so thank you so much for that. But if you enjoyed that, please come to the rest of the forums. Again, June 26th, our next one is Judge David Tatel, not Supreme Court, Circuit Court Judge in D.C., and we'll have another very interesting presentation on another aspect of our present day situation.
Great.
So please stick around, and thank you very much to Dr. Rhodes for coming.
Yeah, and thank you, and thanks to all of you for coming, and you've been an amazing audience. Thanks for the great questions. Thank you.